Hello. Good morning. So, this is not immediately straight into my talk, but because we've been traveling, zigzagging between France and Britain, I thought I'd do a quick recap on something that confuses most British. So, I know we have our ambassadors over in the corner there. I won't ask you direct questions on this, but so this confuses nearly everybody, including me. This is a thing called the British Isles, but it doesn't really exist because the British Isles is not a political entity, but it's the only word anyone's ever come up with to describe this landmass of Ireland and Britain. But of course the two nations are independent. It's the Republic of Ireland, and this is the four nations of the United Kingdom, which are right, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, sometimes referred to as Ulster. So the British Isles, Republic of Ireland, and the United Kingdom, which also includes these other oddities, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, which are not far from where we've just come from, which are much closer to France than the United Kingdom. Guernsey, Jersey, Alderney, Sark, have I forgotten any? And they are crown dependencies. They are not part of the United Kingdom, but they carry British passports, just to confuse everyone. Up here we have Shetland, where Diana was about 2 weeks ago. Shetland is part of Scotland. They don't like the Scottish. We'll talk about, that's kind of the talk today, really, about who likes who and who gets on with who, and it's unfortunately a little bit topical today in the United Kingdom. This is the flag of... No. Correct. This is... Nobody's going to get this. This is the old flag of Ireland, the island of Ireland, which never existed as a nation because it was part of the crown. But this was used to symbolize Ireland in this, which is the Union Jack. So it's wrong because the island of Ireland is not a nation. It is two countries separated. So this diagonal in the Union Jack, which symbolizes the flag of the United Kingdom, not of Great Britain, but of the United Kingdom. Everyone clear so far? Okay, because I'm not. So just to clarify things a little bit, hopefully, England, the old non-existent flag of Ireland, Scotland makes up the Union Jack, which you recognize, obviously. But that's the flag of... Nope. This is the flag of Ulster. Thank you. So this is the flag that should be represented in the Union Jack because it's the flag of Northern Ireland, although it's deeply political, obviously, as most flags are. And anyway, nobody wants to change the flag anymore anyway. So these are the four nations: Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. And as I say, we have some outliers where we were yesterday. Scilly, right down here, which is obviously part of England, Britain, United Kingdom, as you know, because we had the UK border force on to check your passports. Although Scilly is part of Cornwall, and Cornwall wants to be independent as well. So Shetland doesn't like Scotland. Scotland doesn't like England. Nobody likes England, including Cornwall. So, and you will still occasionally meet Cornish people who say they've just come back from England. So there we go. And that's the flag of... Thank you. But where is it in the Union Jack? Nowhere. On the back. So that, including the green of Ireland, of Wales, should be the Union Jack. But it isn't even correct when I say that, because, of course, the flag of Ireland is wrong anyway. So there we go. Cleared all that up. This is the flag of the royal family, the royal standard. And I only mention that because, of course, we've come from the Duchy of Cornwall on the Isles of Scilly, and this is the royal flag. So they don't fly the Union Jack. The monarch only flies this, unless he's not in, and then they fly the Union Jack. So just to completely confuse you, this is flown on as the flag of the monarch in Scotland, because although it's a quarter of the royal standard, they don't like upsetting the Scots when they're at home in their Scottish castles in Balmoral. So there we are. So all of that to say, we have been sailing around this stretch of waterway that the English call the English Channel. The French don't call it the English Channel, for obvious reasons. Which brings me on to the relationship between France and England. Because one of the things that binds Scotland, Ireland, and to some extent Wales and France is that they all hate the English. And that's a place that the English don't like, the European flag. So very briefly, these are the 4 pillars of freedom, which you may have come across, the basis of the European Union, the movement of goods, capital, services and labour. And that was in 2016 where the British drew the line and decided to leave the European Union during a referendum. Very, very briefly, that's how Scotland voted to remain, and that's how the rest of England voted, which was to leave. And the overall result was a very small majority in favour of leaving, which is why the British are no longer in Europe, and it's why those border control officers came on board the other day at Scilly. So there we go. European Union. I'll talk about this maybe on another talk because we're going to run out of time otherwise. Without the United Kingdom, but with Ireland, obviously, which is reaping the benefits of Britain's departure, because as the only now native-speaking English country in the European Union, they're attracting a lot of inward investment from corporations. So there we go. And one of the reasons you had your passport checked yesterday was not directly necessarily related to the European Union. It's also related to this, which is called the Schengen area, which is not related to freedom of movement of people within the European Union, because that's to do with European citizens. When you come in as a American, or now British, to the European area known as Schengen, you are stamped once when you enter any of these countries within Schengen, and your passport is then not stamped until you leave. And I think the maximum is 3 months, depending on your nationality. So you can arrive in Lisbon, where we're heading, obviously, and you can fly to Finland, to Helsinki, and your passport will not be stamped again. So that's Schengen, just in case anyone was wondering. Which brings me on to, as I say, the relationships between countries and nations in Europe, and what I've called, slightly polemically, the great Franco British land grab. So I'm kind of talking about this because we're sailing, as I say, zigzagging between Britain and France, and this is an example, one only example, of the relationship between France and the UK. So we're going to be talking about that imperial history. As I said, the Channel Islands, which are part of the UK, they're down here. They're known in French as les îles Anglo-Normandes. They're not the Channel Islands, because the French don't call it English Channel, because clearly the English don't own it. It's called La Manche. but they are part of the United Kingdom. So, we are talking about the rivalry over many centuries of these two empires, Britain and France, who mostly carved up other large chunks of the rest of the planet over many centuries. And I'm going to be talking in particular about a document that has become more or less shelved in the annals of history, but it is a document that was dreamt up about 100 years ago in secret at right bang in the middle of the First World War. It's a document that was described by a Lebanese author as a terrible piece of treachery. The British and the French carving up the world between them. And the gentleman in question was a Lebanese author called George Antonius, and he described it as this. The document we're talking about, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Has anybody heard of it? The Sykes-Picot Agreement is a shocking document, not only the product of greed at its worst, it is to say greed allied to suspicion and so leading to stupidity. It also stands out as a startling piece of double dealing. So I always like to start by being a little controversial, and that was Antonius's view. I try not to take a view, but I start by taking someone else's view just to kick off the proceedings. And it is basically at its center the story of two men, Sykes and Picot, in 1916, as I say, right bang in the middle of the First World War. So Mark Sykes was a British aristocrat. Some called him charismatic, others called him bumbling and foolish. But he was one part of this agreement. The other was Francois-Georges Picot, who had a very different character altogether. He was a very serious diplomat, and he had, of course, a strong distrust of the British. So together, these two men, right in the middle of the First World War, as I say, would end up dividing the Middle East for France and Britain, somehow managing to double-cross a bunch of other people along the way, but such is diplomacy. Then the document, as I say, that we're going to be talking about is this Sykes-Picot Agreement. But why, really, when we're sailing around the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay, as we will, would we be interested in a document about the Middle East? Well, essentially, it is because it stands as this excellent example of the way that geopolitics was forming in the early part of the last century. So the Middle East at that point was carved up between many of the empires, but particularly France, of course, as I've discussed, in Algeria, and Britain in Egypt, and across to other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And in the end, the fate of an entire region would depend on what happens next. So, sadly, to the conflicts of today. And again, clearly I'm not going to start talking about the Middle East today, but this hopefully also gives you some background about what happened and how we've ended up where we are right now. In the end, what they did was to take some coloured crayons and a ruler in a private house in London and end up with this map. And it was a map that was fairly hazy, and it was based on some research that was, let's say, ill-informed. Sykes-Picot serves, as I say, to some extent to understand this relationship between these two empires, but I'll start by introducing you to a little bit more of our two guys. So, good-looking perhaps, certainly had a good moustache, but he was certainly known as charismatic. He grew up in a beautiful house on the Yorkshire Wolds called Sledmore, which you can visit if you're over in northern England. Mark's father was the Baronet Sir Tatton Sykes. He was, as many aristocrats are, eclectic, let's say. He apparently had a passion for medieval church architecture, as well as maintaining his body at a constant 36 degrees Celsius. That was one of his obsessions. And he also loved milk pudding, apparently. That was another part of his character. So Mark, when his father passed away, inherited the baronetcy and inherited, obviously, some cash. And he decided to go traveling. He didn't have a very happy childhood. So he went as far as he could, and he went to the peninsula of Arabia. And he grew up, not particularly unusually for the aristocracy, let's say, with no lack of self-belief, let's say. He claimed to speak fluent Arabic when he came back from his travels, but he didn't. He mostly just went around saying all sorts of strange expressions that he'd picked up along the way. But he also brought back some souvenirs, some beautiful Ismic tiles, which you can see still at Sledmore. And as I say, he also learned how to shout Allahu Akbar very loudly to impress people. Along the way, Sykes also claimed to his political friends that he knew very much about the Middle East, that he could draw a map of the area on the back of his hand, which he also couldn't. But basically, he convinced quite a few people about his prowess in the region, and that would stand him in good stead for what happened later. It's this idea of, let's say, making stuff up that is alive and well in British politics. Not the only one. But to get serious for a second, this is around 1914. Obviously, World War I has broken out. The Western Front is becoming particularly entrenched, of course, in this awful warfare in the area that we were close to when we left Amsterdam, and is essentially what is now today the Belgian and the French border on what became known, obviously, as the Western Front. So everything was getting pretty bogged down, particularly the Battle of the Marne. And Britain's political leaders decided to meet to figure out how to extract themselves from this increasingly difficult situation. They came up with something called the Eastern Front. It was an idea that was to play out into this agreement that we're going to talk about. The idea was to divert the Germans and to distract them. And at the time, the British allies, Russia, as well as France, but Russia was entrenched in a particularly brutal war as well. The Battle of Sarikamish and Tsarist Russia, of course, at that time was starting to struggle in its pursuit of the control of the area that at the time was the Ottoman Empire. So you've got the Russians trying to push down into the Caucasus, and you have the British and the French stuck in a Western Front over by the Belgian border. What would happen would be instrumental in the Sykes-Picot agreement. The British will later determine that their strategy would involve what became known as the war, the campaign in Gallipoli. But the Tsarist Russian forces are starting to get stuck, and they ask their allies, the British and the French, for some support. So the British hatch a plan, as I say, in Downing Street. They decide that this approach would be to support the Russians by taking the Gallipoli Peninsula, but they had, not surprisingly, other motives too. They had a bigger plan, which was going to determine what happens next. Because the British Empire, as well as the French, as well as the Russians and others, had had their sights on Istanbul or Constantinople for many centuries. Istanbul will be where Diana calls at the middle of September, but it is particularly strategic, of course, for the entire region. If you can take Istanbul, you can move across, take the Ottoman Empire at its heart, and you then have access to the Arabian Peninsula, which was very thinly populated at the time. Not for oil, because this is not a period when oil dominates, but for one other reason. Particularly for the British, it would give you access to the Red Sea and to control of the British colonies, India and East Africa and Australia. And that was one of the reasons they'd been pushing towards Constantinople for a while. So it's fairly useful for them that the Russians are asking them for their support, and hence this idea of the Eastern Front. So they decide to attack on that Gallipoli Peninsula, and in particular, strategically, to try to blow up the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, which had been built recently by the German forces and their allies, the Ottomans. Anybody seen Lawrence of Arabia, the movie? Remember that scene where they try and blow up the railway? That's what they were trying to do. If they can attack that infrastructure project, they can get to the heart of the supply chain, obviously, down into those areas. But this is the cunning British plan. Despite fighting alongside France and its other allies on that Western Front that I mentioned, the British were developing this Eastern Front in secret. And this is what the French then get very upset about, because down the line, their spies get wind of this Eastern Front idea, and their worst suspicions are confirmed. They always thought of those dastardly Brits as untrustworthy, and now they really smell a plot. Not just because the British plan, if it succeeds, would cut them out of great swathes of the Arabian Peninsula and Constantinople that they also had their eyes set on, but it would also suggest, not unrealistically, that the British were losing interest or perhaps weakening their support of the French on the Western Front. Of course, as I say, the French had never really trusted the British ever since William the Conqueror, the 7 Years' War, which obviously implicated their long, drawn-out fight across North America, and the 2-century-long French attempts to compete with the British East India Company through the Compagnie Française des Indes, the version of the East India Company that the French set up to trade in India. There was also a massive fight against British occupation of Egypt, Napoleon's botched Battle of the Nile. And I'll be maybe talking about Napoleon in my lecture tomorrow. Anyway, just as in Britain, just to paint a picture if you like, there was let's call it a romantic notion taught in France about Arabia, an idea of a great empty mass of sand dunes, a place of adventure and exploration, and this idea crops up to some extent in British literature, but more intensely, let's say, in much French literature, and many memoirs dating right back to Louis and the Crusades. This idea that Arabia had this wonderful, romantic, adventurous future ahead of it for the colonial forces. In fact, France had done much to establish itself within the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, right back then, under something called the Ottoman capitulations, and that had led to an agreement in the 19th century with this man, Muhammad Ali Pasha, ruler of the Ottomans in Egypt at that point. And as a result of the French alignment with the Egyptian ruler, we end up with construction of the Suez Canal, where Diana will also be traveling after leaving Istanbul through Cyprus and into Suez. So as you can see, the French, like the Germans, were interested in these great infrastructure projects. If you can find places where you can invest and build infrastructure with your allies, you have a chance of developing a deep-rooted interest in a region. And the French had kicked off Suez, another place and point of contention between the French and the British, which is a whole other story. But the French decided to build the canal, which upset the British hugely and led to all sorts of other shenanigans. Anyway, just to say, the old rivalries clearly still deeply entrenched. But Suez had made a great deal of that Arabian Peninsula much more interesting. So now that the French rumbled this British plan of the Eastern Front, the Brits are a little bit on edge. They're nervous that the French are going to start wondering about the strength of their alliance in the First World War. So what do they have to do? They have to offer them an olive branch, and they do just that. They give them a piece of the action, let's say, a sweetener, and Sykes-Picot is born. The ill-fated battle of Gallipoli in 1915 would turn out, of course, to be utterly disastrous for the Allies, with a loss of 130,000 soldiers on both sides, not least for the British colonial troops known as the Anzacs, the Australians and the New Zealanders. And also politically a massive dent or humiliation for this supposedly invincible British Empire. So this was now when things start going badly wrong. Back in London, the Middle East plotting, despite Gallipoli, continues, though, behind those closed doors at 10 Downing Street. The British, still convinced of their invincibility despite Gallipoli, were convinced, too, that the Ottomans could be defeated, and they hoped to seize a huge control of the then Ottoman Empire. This is it at its greatest height. We don't talk about it a great deal in some of the history that I had when I was younger, but this gives you some idea of some of the regions that the Ottomans controlled. So if you can push back against the Ottomans, who at this point were slightly weakened, you could maybe take great swathes of that region. But as I say, the Russians too were tasting some of that possible reward from taking some of this region, maybe even moving down this way. And the British had been, for many centuries, terrified of that Russian advance into their regions and control of much of the empire. So you can see if the Russians are coming down this way, albeit allies in the First World War, there's going to be a standoff around Constantinople. And that was called the Great Game. The Russians and the British involved in a constant dogfight around the Caucasus. But as I say, now that France has rumbled the Great British Plan, they had to act quickly. And particularly in case the Russians find out about this idea of the Eastern Front and their idea of taking Constantinople. But the two men that then meet had actually very little understanding of the region, but I'll come on to that in a moment. So they get together, as I say, the politicians at Number 10, and they start to hatch this plot, this plan, this scheme, this negotiation, if you're being generous. They were Herbert Kitchener, who was Governor-General of Egypt. He at least had some understanding of the region. There was Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, the future Prime Minister Lloyd George, and the then current British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour. So those are the four men who then suggested that we should come up with an agreement that became Sykes-Picot, but on the other side there was George Picot. And as I say, he could not have been more different. He was apparently fairly humorous. Humorless, I should say. His father, George, had written several books about the dastardly Brits, including the British takeover of Egypt and the French trying to wrest control back in the late 19th century. So that resentment and that suspicion ran deep. So Picot Jr. was a professional diplomat. He was maybe a spy, but either way, he was posted to the French embassy in London just at the point of another magnificently stupid squabble between Britain and France called the Fashoda incident. And Fashoda was a spot on the Upper Nile in Sudan where the French tried to sabotage the British and tried to dam the Nile, and the British wrested it back. And all of this just to say that those deep suspicions were entrenched in the minds of George Picot. So Fashoda reinforced this French idea of something that they knew in France as l'Albion perfide, perfidious Albion. The British could not be trusted. And in London, the manoeuvring starts to warm up. The idea is to take control of this region, as I mentioned. Not the whole of the Ottomans, but if you can take Constantinople, you can move down to the Hejaz. This was the area that was particularly of interest because the ports along the way would allow access to the Red Sea, and beyond that, of course, to control of those colonies that I mentioned. So, initially, rather than tell the French about their plans, the British had actually been wooing this man, Sharif Hussein. He was the tribal ruler of Mecca in the Hejaz, and he was supposedly a dependent of the Prophet Muhammad, but knowing that the Sharif was no friend of the Ottomans, the British promised him land in return for joining them in that fight against the Ottomans. Hussein, though, was a pretty good negotiator too. He makes a bigger demand. He wants a large swathe of the Arabian Peninsula, not just this little piece of land that the British offered him. He wanted a piece right the way to the Syrian and Turkish borders. British Foreign Secretary of the time, Sir Edward Grey, writes him a letter granting him his wish, but if you read it carefully, it's fairly obtuse. It doesn't actually make the promise that the Sharif thinks it makes. And obviously, translated into Arabic, it becomes even more obscure. At this time, the British Arab Bureau is in full swing, and that is where, not that Lawrence, clearly Peter O'Toole, but this Lawrence, the real T.E. Lawrence, was based at the time. British spy among many active in the region. And it is at this point that the French spies in the region rumble Grey's letter, promising that territory to the Sharif. So when Picot is told that the British intend to carve up chunks of Arabia between themselves and the Arabs, he demands a meeting at number 10, and he tells the British how utterly affronted France is at Britain's treachery. He's also a pretty good negotiator. The British are rattled, as I say. They have to cut him in on the action, but they don't know how to do it. And this is the point of Sykes-Picot, because those four politicians that I mentioned had very little understanding of the region, and they desperately needed someone who did. And who steps up, of course, but Sykes, who has convinced them that he speaks Arabic, has convinced them that he could draw a map of the area on the back of his hand, and has convinced them that he's the guy for the job. And they are fairly easily, let's say, persuaded by his charisma and his charm. So the stage is set, let's say, for these three characters, Picot, Sykes, and Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, who has been wooed by Grey with that letter. But of course, nobody trusts anybody, and the British politicians then decide that Sykes is the man for the job, as I say. So Sykes produces, excuse me, one of the few maps of the Arabian Peninsula that was in existence, published by the Royal Geographical Society in 1910. I mentioned that he was a little bit of a buffoon, let's say, or charismatic, depending on your point of view. But when he persuades those colleagues of his at number 10, he uses an expression which has been enshrined to some extent in this rather ghastly history of the Middle East. He talks about drawing a line from the E, let's go back to that slide, from the E of Acre, which is today Haifa, to the K of Kirkuk, to separate territory from the French and the British. And that is essentially what happens. That line becomes drawn on the map with a ruler, with those crayons here in Buckingham Gate, which is the private home of Sykes. So as I say, they were desperate, the politicians in number 10. Everyone needed a solution. They had plenty of other things on their agendas. Clearly, the war wasn't going well. but they had to understand how to get out of this situation where the French had rumbled their plans to the Eastern Front. They had the Sharif waiting for something to happen, and they suddenly needed a diplomatic solution. And that happens here, as I said, in Buckingham Gate, in Sykes' private home. The two men put in front of them that map that Sykes had found at the Royal Geographical Society, and over the next 3 weeks, they simply trade chunks of land between them. You could call it the Entente Cordiale, which was an expression enshrined in 1904, but it does describe to some extent what happens next. So, as I said, locked in this room in Buckingham House, they drew up this sketchy blue areas where the French would control the land. Let's go back to that map. And where the British would, giving the British the Persian Gulf, covering Basra almost up to Baghdad, and the French, Lebanon and Syria, nudging into what then becomes, after World War I, Turkey, as they correctly predicted, the Ottoman Empire declines. And in a nod, let's say, to what had been vaguely agreed with the Sharif, they come up with a fudge that gives him and his Hashemite family some authority and autonomy over regions that would become Transjordan and Iraq, but away from the all-important, profitable coastal trading ports over the Red Sea, which is really what they were interested in. And all of this, as I say, was hand-drawn in that house with those coloured crayons in January 1916, with a diagonal line running from southwest to northeast. It takes little account, of course, of some of the things that you might expect to be integral to decisions like this. Very little account of rival factions, of indigenous Bedouin territories, of regional sensitivities. When it came to Palestine, the duo stopped short. They ducked the issue, and they actually left it to someone else, someone who was in that meeting at number 10 Downing Street. And that becomes the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Have you heard of it? That we have heard of a lot more than we hear of Sykes-Picot. Balfour writes an almost, I think it's fair to say, impossible guarantee of a homeland to British Jews. It's a one-page letter promising a Zionist state in Palestine, while at the same time insisting that the region shouldn't impact the Arabs and the Palestinians. Were those promises well-intentioned? Were they naive? Were they simply a rushed fudge, perhaps, in the heat of war? Did they lack the courage and effort to find a real solution? Were they perhaps proper diplomatic, cynical maneuvers in the hard light of realpolitik? They're difficult questions to answer. But this is the very short Balfour Declaration. It's not a treaty. It's not an agreement. It is simply a letter that was written to British Jewry at the time, offering this Zionist solution. Anyway, a year later, what happens is that Tsarist Russia goes up in smoke. And, of course, the British and the French have failed to tell their Russian allies about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's all been done in secret in this house in Buckingham Gate. And the Bolshevik Revolution changes everything, of course. And that is how the world first gets to hear about Sykes-Picot. Because it's only when the Bolsheviks break into the Tsar's archives that they discover a copy of the secret agreement that the Tsar apparently was aware of, but did little to protect Russia from, let's say, in his demise. And naturally, the Bolsheviks see it as a perfect example of collaboration with the colonialists of the west of Europe, And to maximize the political impact of their finding it, they pass it on to this man, Enver Pasha, who is the leader of the Young Turks, the revolutionary movement in Constantinople that at that point is starting to take power over the Ottomans. And Enver Pasha then reads out the agreement in public as proof of how the old colonial powers can never be trusted and how the Sharif was essentially a puppet of the West, how he'd been duped and was a fool to ever have believed the Western imperialists. So all of this is going full circle. The story of Sykes-Picot, to some extent, explains those deep-rooted mistrusts, also of the Arab nations that were starting to emerge of the Western empires, and also the rise, you could explain, perhaps, of Wahhabism in what is today Saudi Arabia. That strong sense of independent nationhood among the growing Arab states and their strong distrust of any agreement with the European empire forces. So let's go back briefly to Sykes-Picot. The thing to understand is that the British and the French, to us perhaps today, seemed, let's say, blasé about the whole notion of carving up the Middle East. Maybe it's really just how they could do things at the time. They didn't have any other resources to do it, but it was obviously something that would come back to bite us a century later to some extent. They didn't even bother to legalize it. It is not a legal treaty. It is simply an exchange of letters between the French ambassador in London and that foreign minister who wrote the letter to Sharif. That's the French ambassador, Paul Campbell, and the British foreign minister, Edward Grey. So those two imperial nations were so confident of their powers, let's say, that they didn't even need to legalize it. It was essentially a gentleman's agreement between these two men in the end, who simply enshrined it. Anyway, if you're interested in any more of this, if I haven't bored you completely yet, you'll find the original Sykes-Picot in some dusty archives in the UK. But all that to say, maybe a dusty old document, but the repercussions, whatever your politics, I think you will agree, has a huge impact on the situation today. Recently, just as a little backstory, the British Council conducted a survey in the UK and France to find out how many people were aware of Sykes-Picot. Roughly 1 in 10 had vaguely heard of it. In Egypt, to give it some context, the figure is 7 out of 10. So you can see how certain different parts of history impact different perceptions. So those imperial decisions, let's say, barely known in England and France, yet many people in the Middle East trace many of their border issues back to Sykes-Picot and back to those two men in 1916. And as I say, they were border decisions drawn as lines in the sand in a room in London, which continues to influence the Middle East, sadly, today. But that, for now anyway, is my brief run-through of what happened in a dusty room back in London. I'm more than happy to hear your input. I'm trying to stay fairly even and balanced about it. Clearly, the British and French were far from even or balanced, and nor either were many of the Arab nations that then had to deal with these lines drawn by rulers and coloured crayons. But that, for now anyway, is my introduction to Sykes-Picot. Thank you. So any thoughts?